Hello and welcome to the evening session of Slipper Camp. Today we have for our first program Martha Burtis talking to us about grading and assessment and what might change during remote learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-lab partner extraordinaire, Martha.
Thank you, Robin. Can you see my
and yes,
screen,
you are
everybody?
sharing your slides perfectly. But you're
Great.
also breaking up a tiny bit, Martha.
Okay, let me know if it gets worse.
Okay, will do.
Hopefully my family, hey, Eric, tell the kids to get off of streaming media right now. He's in the other room with them. So thank you all for being here, especially at night. I've been absolutely floored by how many people we've had all day, but the fact that we now have going on 30 people who've tuned in at 7 o'clock at night to talk about this is amazing. I mean, I know part of it is that there's absolutely nowhere else that any of you can go, but I still really appreciate it. I am Martha Burtis. I work in the CoLab as the learning and teaching developer, if you have not met me. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about grading and assessment, which is sort of one of my passions. Those of you who've heard me present before about this know that I mostly talk about a strategy of grading that's come to known as ungrading, or maybe alternative assessment. For tonight, I really wanted to broaden that a little bit because I know not all of you are necessarily interested in just getting rid of grades in the fall. So I'm going to try and frame this to be a little bit more maybe accessible for people coming from lots of different places. Returning to the ACE framework, these are the kinds of practices that I think we're intersecting with here. Certainly some adaptability practices, as well as potentially some connections and building more connection into our classes as part of our assessment strategies. I also will confess to you that because this is a topic that I am so passionate about, I have way too many slides. Rest assured, I'll be sharing all of them. You can always follow up with me about questions that you have, but I may through some of them a little bit quickly. This is just some feedback that came in from the faculty forum that was related to assessment and grading. Some concerns about moving to the pass no pass option, a few concerns about just the overwhelming amount of work involved, and that switching to online grading sometimes makes that work seem even more, just more. How to really do formative feedback in both a thoughtful way, but an efficient way when we're dealing with online. So that's some of the context that I was dealing with when I was thinking about this. I wanted to throw this quote up. This is from Kathy Davidson and Christina Katapodis, who are both at CUNY, just because I thought this was a really great quote. It's from a recent IHE article by them. Comparing kind of the parallel of what we're seeing in the testing of a vaccine and this whole year-long, at least year-long calendar or schedule that we're looking at before we have a viable vaccine, and how difficult that is, and how that compares to how really, if we were doing this in higher education, if we were taking our courses online, rethinking all the things we've been talking about today, including assessment, we would take a year to do that too, right? But just like they're trying to figure out, is there any way to speed up the schedule with vaccine research and production, we've all by necessity had to speed up the schedule for our own development and our own transition and pivot. So I'm breaking this presentation kind of into two parts. The first one is more about retooling traditional assessment and some strategies that you might want to think about. If you just want to see if there's something you can do differently with what you traditionally do. The other one is really more about, is this a moment when you could pivot and do another pivot and pivot to ungrading techniques and ungrading strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about why you might do that. These are two different quotes. I'm not going to read both of these to you, but I encourage you to go back and look at them in the slide deck. Jason Openo is the co-author of a book that I'm going to share with you in a moment. That I think is a fantastic resource about this topic, where he really is talking in this quote about how moving to online with assessment doesn't really change anything. And if anything, it takes what's already challenging and makes it more difficult. And so the reason that he and his co-author wrote this book was to try and help unpack that a little bit. And then Adam Rosenblatt, who's a little bit more leaning towards the ungrading part of this, is really talking specifically about COVID-19 and the ways in which we have to kind of hold at bay this emergency thinking, and how it can sometimes push us in directions that are really not ideal. One of which is we get really hung up on this idea of fairness and objectivity, and how do we maintain fairness and objectivity once we've moved online? The reality being, this is my feeling as somebody who believes in ungrading and many researchers in this area, that fairness and objectivity doesn't really exist in traditional grading. And so getting hung up on that sometimes thwarts us from moving forward and investigating and trying new things. But let's start with retooling traditional assessment, ways in which you might do this, why you might do this. These echo some of the things that were told in the faculty survey. So one of which was about creating opportunities for more student choice and voice, both in assignments and in how things are assessed. Having more formative assessment. I think everybody probably knows the difference between formative assessment, but usually the simple, easy way to say this is formative assessment is feedback. Summative assessment is grades. And so how do we do more meaningful formative assessment and more meaningful representative summative assessment, or a summative evaluation, we would say, in online contexts? And then maybe I put a question mark after this, is there a way to maybe save a little bit of time and make all of this a little bit easier, less of a lift for us? So now I'm going to talk through some strategies, and full disclosure, almost all of these strategies are pulled from that book by Jason Apeno that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to show you a slide with the title of that. The great thing about this book is it is available in a Creative Commons license. You can download the entire PDF and read it tonight for your bedtime story. All of these strategies, all of these examples are pulled from an appendix of this book. There's lots more to the book than just these. But if these intrigue you, if these stories intrigue you, I highly encourage you to follow up by looking at the book. So this is from Ellen Rose. She's a professor in the doctoral program at the University of New Brunswick. And it's about a different approach to participation grades, which I think we had some questions today about things like attendance grades. I don't know if anybody asked specifically about when you move to online, how do you deal with participation grades? Like, some of us have an understanding in traditional face-to-face classes of how we assess participation. And there's lots of varied ways of doing that in face-to-face contexts. But what does that look like when you're moving to online, particularly if what you're moving to is an asynchronous course in online? What does participation look like? And so what she really did is worked with students on asking them to assess their own participation, but not just kind of loosey-goosey, hey, tell me what you think you did. Instead, sitting down at the beginning of the course and coming up in collaboration with students on a set of indicators and defining a rubric collaboratively with students to help them think critically about their participation in the class, and helping them to think about what does quality of participation look like rather than quantity of participation. Because it's easy, sometimes when we move to online, we go to the quantity. We go the quantity route, right? So we'll say, well, participation looks like 5 comments on the discussion forum. But any of us who've done that before knows that invariably what happens with some students is they leave comments that are really not great comments, because what they hear in their head is 5. They don't hear comment, they hear 5. And so they're looking at checking that off the list. So recasting this around quality, what is a quality comment? And maybe modeling for them for a couple of weeks what quality comments look like, calling out students who are doing this really well and sharing why that's done really well, as opposed to just turning this into a checklist that allows students to not really reflect upon the activity of what it is they're doing with participation. This is another really popular one in both face-to-face classes, but definitely in online classes. When I asked on Twitter from my network for examples of how people handle assessment in online courses, many people responded by saying blogs, portfolios, online journals, reflective work that people are sharing publicly on the web. Some of that has to do with the kind of people who I follow on Twitter. But this is also just a kind of a common and increasingly important practice, I think, that people are embracing in online courses. So this is really taking the whole idea of an e-portfolio, reflective journal, which in the case of an e-portfolio already exists fully online, and making that a core component of the course, where students are demonstrating their skills and competencies through sharing assignments, writing about those assignments. This is a really important part, that it's not just about the product in the e-portfolio, it's about the process that they're able to put out there, help you to understand the process by which they created that product, which in many cases ends up being a far more interesting record of their learning than the final product itself. So this is another practice that you may want to think about incorporating into your courses. This is one that I'd never kind of really thought about before, but if you're somebody who really does do a lot of quizzing or testing in your classes, this was an example from Noah Ebner. He's a professor of negotiation at Creighton University, balancing this idea of formative and summative in quizzing. So a series of quizzes that are offered that really are formative, because as students fill them out, they automatically get feedback when they get wrong answers that point them then to additional resources, additional readings, additional follow-up that they should be doing to learn whatever it is that they're not quite grasping yet. And they can take those as many times as they want. There are several of these as they're covering a particular theme or unit. And then a final, more summative assessment that still points people to resources, but is really meant to be more of a capstone assessment, so that they can kind of practice this knowledge several times in a low stakes way before they move to the more high stakes graded assessment. In his case, these are all automated assessments. He's doing these through the LMS. That depends a lot on the discipline that you teach in, whether or not you can do that in such a way. But if quizzing is important to you, if that kind of assessment really, you feel like there's no way you can kind of let go of that, this might be a way to do it that's a little bit more nuanced and is likely to help students kind of climb the ladder to that knowledge a little bit more easily. This actually is not from the book that I mentioned. TJ Murphy is a pharmacology professor at Emory University who we're friends on Twitter. And when I asked about this there, he talked about this. I just thought it was really interesting. He's actually sent me, he's been incredibly generous. He sent me via email a link to a website with an example of this if anybody wants to see it. But he creates these open internet problem solving tasks in his classes, in his pharmacology classes, but they're broken into parts. So there's a correct answer that students are meant to get to, but each part is tackled discretely. And it allows him, first of all, to take what are big problems and break them down into smaller pieces. Each piece has a quote unquote correct answer students have to arrive at. But they can work collaboratively to do that. They can use resources to solve those problems. Because there is a right answer, he can look at it quickly and tell if they've gotten it right. But he's kind of doing minimal grading then. So it's, if you don't do it and turn it in on time, then you don't get credit really for it. If there's too many errors or you miss something big, you get kind of C credit on it. If you get it mostly correct, you get 100% on it and you move on to the next part. So this allows him to move through the grading fairly quickly, but also I think has the benefit for the students of taking what are pretty big questions, pretty big challenges, and breaking it down so that they're not looking at that big picture, they're thinking about this a little bit more systematically. Feedback and revision, there's nothing magical about this, but some people are great at it and some of us look on it in awe and wonder, how could I do that? But if writing in particular is part of your practice and part of your classes, focusing really on doing feedback-based drafting before you get to final product. There's lots of evidence and research that shows this is incredibly useful and effective when teaching writing to students, and I'm sure can be mapped to other practices and disciplines as well. The idea being that when students turn in drafts, you don't read them for a grade. you don't even read them to give them feedback on everything. You focus on 3 things maybe and give them that feedback, and you tell them to revise, and then they turn in the next one and you focus on 3 things again. And the idea is to build into them a natural understanding that that writing is a process, that creating knowledge this way is a process. And you don't even talk about grade until you get to that final version. And hopefully if they've gone through that revision process with you, that grade really isn't a shock or a surprise, because they've seen that evolution and you've seen that evolution as well. This is a really pragmatic thing, but a number of people have mentioned it to me before. There's actually 2 examples of it in the book I'm going to share with you, of faculty using voice marking in online classes as a way to provide feedback. Lots of tools that are available to do this. And for many faculty, this is much, much easier than written feedback, because it allows you to kind of do stream of consciousness, almost as though you were doing a conference with a student. You know, if you're like me, I find leaving comments in Word documents to be one of the most soul-sucking things I can do. Like, it leaves me exhausted, drained. It never really feels like it's very useful. Comments in Google Docs are a little better, but I also find grading student work that way to be kind of counterintuitive in a way, whereas this process of recording yourself, audio, or you could do video, giving students feedback on their work, can both make your job a little bit easier, save you a little bit of time, and for students potentially feel a little bit more personal and a little more immediate than a lot of text markup on their work. This is the book that I've been using for most of this. Again, it's a fantastic book, Assessment Strategies for Online Learning. The link will be in these slides when we share them, but if you Google this title, you will find it now. It's out of the University of Athabasca Press. They have a whole series on distance and online learning. Some really great stuff. I highly recommend this one. So let's talk about,
do you have any suggestions for tools about voice marking, or is that the kind of thing someone should maybe make an appointment with you for?
You can absolutely make an appointment with me, and I'm happy to talk about some suggestions at the end. I can tell you what's recommended in the book, and some of those are things that I've used before. Some of them I'm not as familiar with though, so it might be something that I would just want to sit down and look through things with you. Is that good? Nobody's talking, so I think
Yes.
that's good. So let's talk about this pivot, the pivot to ungrading. And what is ironic is I said, okay, now I'll make a slide about the benefits of the pivot to ungrading. They were all exactly the same, except this one thing I've crossed out, which is that with ungrading, you really do eliminate the whole idea of summative evaluation in the same way that you've been using it traditionally in your assessment strategies. So it's still about creating opportunities for student choice and voice. It's still about more and better formative assessment. Or maybe if you don't do formative assessment, just doing formative assessment. And for some people, it's also about saving time. There's also lots more benefits, but I'm not going to go into the weeds on this. So some practices for pivot for ungrading. Some of you have heard me talk about these before. This is probably the most popular one. It's the one that I practice. It's mostly self and sometimes peer evaluation. But what's really important to know about this is that this is not your high school self-evaluation. When we talk about self-evaluation, a lot of people, I think, kind of roll their eyes and think, oh, that's so meaningless. And a lot of our students, I think, have that reaction because, and this is not to denigrate high school teachers in any way at all, but through the course of our K-12 education, frequently, we've been asked to do self-evaluations that haven't really felt like there was much purpose to them. So, or much structure to them. So when I do self-evaluations, they are purposeful, they are structured, and they usually involve some conversation with students about why we're doing them and how we're doing them together. And maybe even are responsive to students saying, this is what I think we should be evaluating or what we should be talking about. I'm happy to share examples of those, but we also have a resource page on the CoLab website with lots more stuff about this. Grade-free zones, I actually meant to move this further down in the presentation. Grade-free zones are basically any of the things I'm about to talk about, but not for your whole course. So identifying a unit, a module, a part, a kind of assignment in your class that could potentially be grade-free. Sometimes as a way to just kind of practice this, sometimes because grade-free doesn't work in all aspects of your classes, but it might work in some of them. Contract grading. Contract grading really basically involves negotiating with your students what you're going to grade and how you're going to grade it. I should say it doesn't always involve negotiating with your students. I would recommend negotiating with your students, but basically you lay out to your students, if you want to get an A, these are the things you have to do. These are the things you have to turn in. If you want to get a B, these are the things you have to do and turn in. It's pretty pragmatic in that sense, but students love it because here's the thing that I didn't know until I started asking them, not all students want A's. I thought they were all like me, but they're not. And sometimes they don't care so much about it getting an A. And when you ask them and they say, oh, actually, I just need to get a C in this class, I breathe a sigh of relief and go, good, because I was grading your work thinking, how am I going to get this student to an A? So contract grading allows students to be a little bit more pragmatic and a little, choose which classes they put their effort into at different times. In an online course, this is something that potentially can save you headache and save you time, because the grading of it for you becomes a little bit more pragmatic, as opposed to having to do a lot of, how does this compare to that student's work? Is this A work? Is that B work? Because you've already kind of negotiated what those boundaries are. Minimal grading, this is made popular by Peter Elbow. The idea of minimal grading is to basically say, instead of having a scale of grades, F to A with pluses and minuses, which I think is like 9 different potential grades, we're gonna have didn't pass, did okay, excelled. 3 grades, right? Or even 2 grades like we do with pass, no pass. It's either red light, green light. And again, what this allows you to do is simplify the assessment process, both for your students and for yourself. Again, in an online course, at times when you're trying to keep things easier, keep things a little more straightforward for yourself and for them, this can be a really useful strategy. Ungraded exams are my colleague Clarissa Sorensen-Unruh at CNM Community Colleges. This is her anecdote about doing this. I've never done an ungraded exam. I think it's a fascinating practice. Basically, it means when your students take an exam, after completing it, they then write sort of a defense or an explanation for the questions that they've answered or that they've gotten wrong, and you negotiate with them based on their ability to sort of explain their answer. She has a whole article that I've linked to that explains, she actually has a 3-part series that explains how she does this. It's fascinating. And that may be something that you're interested in as well. Actually, this slide is 2 parts because it just went on and on. Okay, I have a few minutes left. So now is when I'm going to dive into the philosophical, ethical piece of all of this. Sometimes when we talk about moving to online and grading and assessment, people say, I don't want my students to cheat. What we really should do is invest in a proctoring system. That's the best thing to do. There's lots of companies out there that offer these. These are systems that sit on students' computers or that they access through the web that watch them while they do their work or while they take their exams to try and guarantee that they're not cheating and that they're who they say they are. This is a list of potential harms. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm just going to show you that as I started creating this slide, I had to make the font smaller and smaller and smaller because the harms go on and on and on. And basically what we see is harm and discrimination to various kinds of students who are more vulnerable, as well as creating situations where that could put students at in harm's way because of these practices. There's lots of literature about this. This all comes from an article I'm going to share with you by Shea Swager. And this quote, which I will read, the pedagogy of punishment ignores that what constitutes cheating, plagiarism, and citation are culturally constructed, seemingly arbitrary on first approach, and a source of anxiety for incoming students, especially those not acculturated to higher education. So all day today, we've been talking about our most vulnerable students, or students who need the most help from us. How do we support them? One way we can do that is by not creating grading and assessment systems that victimize them. This is the article, Our Bodies Encoded. It's from Hybrid Pedagogy. I recommend it if you're interested in this. And then this, I had high hopes of doing a dramatic reading of this because I love this article so much by Amy Hasanoff, Do You Trust Your Students?, in which she unpacks for us her own journey to get to ungrading. When I began teaching, I focused on content and rigor. I made the rookie mistake of designing my first course in ways that would have worked perfectly for me as a student. She talks about how she was annoyed and exasperated by students who came to class unprepared, showed up late, and realized she was using grades as leverage to get the results she wanted. And when she started to teach online, she took a similar approach and even heightened her anxiety. She needed to wait to ensure they do the work, even though she couldn't see them and they were not in a physical class. This just goes on to explain how she got to a place focused on critical pedagogy and learner-centered teacher and experimenting by trusting students and learning what that trust really means, what that trust can create. Instead of having empathy, she'd been holding a bit of a grudge against her students. So she started to let her students set their own goals and reflect each week on whether they'd met those goals. It hasn't always been easy for me to start by trusting students, but I realized that it's something I need to work towards if I want to help them focus more on actually learning than on grades. That's Do You Trust Your Students? And one last quote from Kathy Davidson. This is the money quote for me. Even at higher education institutions where residential life is a cornerstone of all they do, it seems somehow easier to close the campus, move every student out of the dorms, and place all courses online than to change policies and practices for how those students will be tested, assessed, and graded. And that's it. I think I hit my mark.
And that's I hadn't seen that quote, Kathy's last quote.
That article is brilliant by Kathy and her grad student.
I have 3 questions in the queue. There may be more. And some of them have a little bit been answered by folks on the chat. And I honestly think these are questions as much for the group as for Martha. So I would encourage anybody to chime in, even though they were answered a little bit in the chat. Let's also remember not everybody's following the chat. So one of the questions is about when you do multiple drafts and focus on revision. How do people deal with that, with the tension of also needing to just move on to the next paper, because obviously that takes so much time to go into a draft process. So maybe particularly for those of you who teach writing, how do you balance the time that it takes to do process-oriented revision, even though you know the benefits of doing that? Does anyone want to chime in on that?
Can I add to that? Because that was my question. I was thinking also, I was thinking of your discussion about like modular courses, right? So if we're trying to have sort of these discrete chunks of courses that maybe are, I feel like revision works really well on like a, half a semester long project that has lots of pieces and time, but it seems less possible. Anyway, that's why I asked that question especially.
Yeah, I'm sure there are more experienced writing professors in this room. Liz, you want to go ahead?
Just that you don't have to do everything, every assignment. One writing class is not going to be responsible for someone's entire writing education. I think because you could spend I feel like I could spend a whole semester working with a student on one essay or like one short story, but I also have these other tensions where I want them to try different in comp. I want them to try different sort of topics and poses and stances, and in creative writing, I want them to try different genres and things. So we have to move on. And I think it's probably different for writing class where they're not gonna be done at the end of my class. They're not gonna have mastered writing at all at the end of my writing class. So for me, part of it is, choose like Martha was saying, like pick 3 things. You have to do all the things. You cannot do all the things. This reminds me too of working in a writing center about, we'd see students for like a 50-minute slice of their writing life. Like, you don't know, like there's all the rest of it you may never see if they're like a one-off visit, but you have this little piece of time, and there's a lot you can do with it, even if it doesn't seem like you're doing a lot.
And I will say, just in the writing assignments I've done, and in fairness, when I've used this technique, it's been in classes that just had a single cumulative paper that students were working on for quite a while. You know, you always hope they'll turn in multiple drafts, but I've seen progress in students from just going through one draft in this process. And part of it too is letting go of, going back to the beginning of this, this notion of kind of fair. Anybody who teaches writing probably understands that this moment when you've graded a bunch of papers one day and then you go to grade another stack the next day and you're in a different mood the next day, right? And so you start looking at these papers and you're like, this is a B, but wait, what about that paper yesterday? Was that a B? How do they compare? It's exhausting, right? It's emotionally exhausting. It takes time. And so one of the things this freed me up to do was to really to let go of that notion that that's fairness, and to instead look at, this is a student who I'm taking from one place to another place. And my job is not to get all students to the same place. My job is to help every student on whatever that journey is for them. And so if they tackle 3 things really well, that may be, you know, grade-wise equivalent to what another student has done in a different way. And so I've seen students do a great job through just one revision, even though the feedback I was giving them was only on a few things, because they learned how to revise, which is what I want them to learn to do. They learned how to take feedback and incorporate it into their work and turn it into something new. And that's the learning outcome I really care about. I can't hear you, Robin.
It could also be for anybody. It's about take-home exams. And what rule of thumb do you use when you're designing questions for exams that you know will be taken at home? And this is kind of outside of the browser lockdown software. So if you know they're at home taking the exam, what kind of questions work best for that? Anybody want to chime in? And I know Martha will have some thoughts too.
I actually didn't hear the first part of that.
Was it Laura? Did you reply?
Who asked that? The person who asked that?
I feel like it might have been Laura.
We posted a response.
It was Eric Hoffman.
Yeah, I posted a response to that because I was actually thinking about that earlier today as I was grading some tests. And I found that the questions where I was asking them to repeat knowledge or solve problems were so much less satisfactory than the questions where I was asking them to integrate different pieces of information or to apply the knowledge. So I was only able to do that partially, but that's a good way to I think build on future tests, regardless of if they are take home or in person. So I was thinking about this earlier. And this was a very mathematical course, but there were ways to integrate information, grabbing pieces from the entire year, not just a semester.
And from a test question design perspective, that's usually kind of the best practice that people recommend. And certainly in online classes, if you have concerns about cheating, if you have concerns about, you don't want your exams to be open book, or you're okay with open book, but you don't want them Googling answers, the solution really is not proctoring. The solution is thinking about how do you create questions that get at synthesis, where the right answer can't be Googled, right? It can't be Googled. And another thing that I was reading that people recommend is, in addition to the answer, you can actually have students have to write some kind of meta explanation as well for how they arrived at the answer. That's definitely not Googleable. And so, taking those two strategies, and frankly, as like an instructor, I'm far more interested in the meta than I am in the actual answer. Like, I would probably not even pay that much attention to the answer. I would look at that meta explanation of how they constructed the knowledge to really try and get an understanding of their learning.
I'm going to ask one question from some strange guy named Eric Burtis. And then after that, I'm going to toss it to Abby for a question. Eric wants to know, and I think lots of people are interested in this, if you do some kind of funky grading, like binary grading or green light grading or pass, no pass, and Matt, this could be something you chime in with too, because I think you have something to say to this, even though we switched to pass, no pass. What do you do when it comes down to banner and you've got to enter B+ or C-? How do you rectify your funkiness with the bottom line?
With the bottom line. So when you do minimal grading, you don't just do that in a vacuum, right? Like you have a whole semester's worth of work and you've created a minimal grading framework for that entire semester so that at the end, you can look at the cumulative impact of all of that minimal grading, and it actually helps you arrive at a final grade. I don't know if Matt, you have anything else you want to chime in on that?
In one of my previous lives, when I was teaching composition, we used a mix of minimal grading and then contract grading. The minimal grading was for the assignments, the individual assignments. The contract grading was for the course as a whole. And so within that, we could create a way that the minimal grading was sort of translated into the contract of, you do this, you get this number of your homework assignments, get a check or whatever, then that guarantees you a B. We were using a B contract. It's you do these things, you're guaranteed a B. And that worked pretty well. And the students seemed to like it. It took a little bit of explaining at the front end because it was, of course, completely unfamiliar to them. But once we were really into it, they really liked it because it was just very clear communication. If we think of grading as a type of communication, it was very clear and easy to keep track of.
I'm going to toss it to Abby, who had a question she wanted to ask.
I have two questions now, and I don't know if all of them need to be answered, and I think some of them have been part of the larger ungrading conversation that's happened this year. And the first is, I'm interested in ungrading in different contexts for different particular types of courses, because this conversation to me seems really easily translatable to an NCAP or particular parts of an upper level English course. But I'm curious, because I know some folks do it in TWP, what that looks like and how you introduce the concept of ungrading to students who are new to college and all these other realms. My second question is, and I think we've already talked about this, is minimal grading the same as ungrading? Because it seems like you can give lots of process-based feedback and have a self-assessment and a conversation. But even when I tried to attempt ungrading this year, I found that no matter what, in the end, there was always an end point where I was assigning some sort of a value. And so I'm risking like putting myself out there for critique right now, and I feel really vulnerable. But I set up a situation where I listed different possibilities and criteria, and instead of assigning a grade, I used to have like a rubric. I had them write a self-assessment and an analysis about how they met the various criteria and what went well. And this was for a student-led lesson. And then I said, like, once you do that, you get a 100 for I didn't know, it was like falling off a cliff. It was like, we did all this interesting intellectual work, and then it was like, and then I guess you get a 100. It felt so, I didn't know what to do with that final like moment in Moodle where you put something into a spreadsheet. Does that make sense?
So yeah, it does. And I would love to respond to both of those. So I'm going to start with the second one and just say to you that feeling of vulnerability I relate to completely from when I first started doing this. I think if you've graded traditionally and it feels like jumping off a cliff, and there is almost this sense of, oh my gosh, what am I getting away with? Am I abdicating my responsibility as a faculty member? Like, isn't my job to do this differently? And so I think the fact that you're feeling that, if my experience is any lesson, it means that you're doing it right. And what I would say about minimal grading as an ungrading strategy is that minimal grading isn't the same thing as, okay, your grade is do a peer evaluation and that's your grade, which is another strategy. But what the point of minimal grading is to try and create a framework for grading that is different than you, the professor, are the final arbiter of an evaluative judgment on a student, right? It's about, and hopefully it's about having a conversation with students about what these grades reflect and what they mean. And to me, that is philosophically what ungrading is about, right? Like, even if ultimately there's still, yes, there are grades assigned. One of the things that I discovered in doing ungrading is at a certain point, the grade almost just becomes irrelevant because you enter into a different kind of conversation with your students about their learning. Yes, you're still assigning grades. Everybody knows there's going to be a grade at the end of the semester, but nobody's obsessing about it day to day, week to week. Instead, you're focused on the work and you're focused on the metacognition. And so when the grade gets assigned at the end, it almost seems irrelevant. I'm sure it's relevant to students, but it's not a surprise for most of them. In terms of introducing it to students, I've never taught TWP here, but I did teach first year seminar at my previous institution and did ungrading in that. I had frank conversations with my students about what ungrading was. I had them read The Case Against Grades by Alfie Cohen. They would always be skeptical when I would introduce it, and then they'd read his article and they'd come back and they'd be like, grades suck. Why are people grading us? So bringing them into that conversation, inviting them to reflect upon their own experience with grades and their own experience with school, in my experience, has been incredibly valuable. And like I said, it shifted my entire approach to teaching. I mean, and my relationship with my students. Going back to my earlier presentation about community, the thing that allowed community to grow in my classes was getting rid of grades.
Let's toss it
I
to
can
Liz.
interject.
Apparently you cannot. No, just, I don't even know who that was. So interjector, go ahead and say something, and then Liz is going to bring us home.
Okay, so sorry, this is Nick. So I took the plunge at the pivot to ungrading and moved from a traditional grading model to a completely labor-based model. And as Kathy is saying in the chat, like constantly telling them, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and then reminding of it. That was something that had to, that worked. But the other thing I think was emphasizing that I was no longer grading based on sort of a, you know, an internalized subjective idea of the quality of their work. I was grading on the labor of their work, and this is exactly what they needed to do. And Asu Inue's book, and I think Peter Elbow's as well, they always use these like matrices where it says like, if you want an A, you need to do this many papers, show up for this many peer reviews, do this many weekly posts. And I made a clear version of that and walked them through it constantly. And that, I think, I didn't get any complaints, and I was asking for them anonymously. I was like asking for the complaints, but you know, again, like Kathy's saying, the constant reminders, here's what we're doing. Here's what I'm valuing your labor right now. That's what worked for me.
I just wanted to share, mostly for Abby, but for everybody, I threw myself, like I've been most like semi-ungrading for years because I never would put a grade on a piece of writing that we were working on in draft, like, but at some point at the end of the semester I had to come up with a grade. So with my composition class this semester, I'm like, we're doing it. Started out with the John Warner article about different signs of growth other than a grade. Had that conversation like the first or second day of class. And we had some visits from some job candidates. Lovely. One of them is actually in the room with us now. So that took a little time in my comp class. And then I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, unplanned, shockingly. And like I knew that the way I wanted to do this was very hands-on and like constant conversation. And spring break came. I was out of the hospital. I was feeling good. We were finally gonna get there. They had done self-evaluation for 6-week grades. And then this hit. And I was like, I can't do it. I cannot. I was already so deeply uncomfortable. And so I switched to a contract, a labor-based contract. Here's this check, you know, slashed so much out of the course, made these 3 checklists. Like they didn't, like I slashed so hard that my students were sort of perpetually confused for a while because they couldn't believe how much I had cut. They're like, what about the portfolio? I'm like, does this list say portfolio? Like there's no portfolio. And I had a conversation with one of my students who was really like struggling with going to that after she had seen the potential. Anyway, I just wanted to share with Abby and everybody, like, I think it's possible with my comp class. I'm really excited to do it in the fall. I felt bad about sort of pivoting back instead of further into it. They might have been able to do it. I don't know, but I couldn't do it. So anyway, I'm looking forward to having another pass in the fall. Sorry.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Martha.
Yeah,